Well, hello and welcome to class number 2 for the Genesis Bible study. Now, we are just going to go through Genesis 1 through Genesis 2, verse 3. And then next week we'll pick up where we left off. But everything we're going to do is going to build off of this. Once again, a lot of these teachings I got from Tim Mackey, Marty Solomon. Tim and Marty, if for some reason you found this video, thank you. Appreciate how you've helped me see the Bible in a more fuller way. But let's go. Everything we're going to talk about today is like foundational for what we're going to talk about in the future. So we need to pay close attention. All right. Great. Let's just start reading. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was chaos and waste, and darkness was on the surface of the deep. And the Ruach Elohim, Spirit of God, was hovering above the surface of the water. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, so God distinguished the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So there was evening and there was morning one day. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the water. Let it be for separating water from water." So God made the expanse, and it separated the water that was below the expanse from the water that was over the expanse. And it happened so. God called the expanse sky. So there was evening, and there was morning, a second day. Then God said, "Let the water below the sky be gathered to one place, let the dry ground appear." And it happened so. God called the dry ground land, and the collection of the water he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Let's stop here for a second. Already, what are we noticing? Any thoughts here? One thing that we would like to go ahead and point out is that phrase, "there was evening and there was morning." Now, that's not how we here as Westerners do days, right? Days are morning and evening. So already we can start to see some of the cultural differences in a ancient Hebrew mindset. A day begins at sundown. That's why the Sabbath goes from Friday night to Saturday night. Okay. What else do we see? It looks like that day 1 is good. God saw the light was good. Day 3 is also good. God saw that it was good. So there's evening and morning and third day. Day 2. For some reason, God doesn't call it good. Don't know why. Let's keep going. Then God said, this is verse 14, "Let lights in the expanse of the sky be for separating the day from the night. They will be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. They will be for lights in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the land." And it happened so. Then God made the 2 great lights, the greater light for dominion over the day, and the lesser light, as well as the stars for dominion over the night. God set them in the expanse of the sky to shine on the land and to have dominion over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So there was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. Then God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures. Let flying creatures fly above the land across the expanse of the sky." Then God created the large sea creatures and every living creature that crawls with which the water swarms according to their species, as well as every winged flying creature according to their species. And God saw that it was good. Then God blessed them by saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the water in the seas. Let the flying creatures multiply on the land." So there was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. Then God said, "Let the land bring forth living creatures according to their species, livestock, crawling creatures, wild animals according to their species." And it happened so. God made the wild animals according to their species, the livestock according to their species, and everything that crawls on the ground, each according to its species. And God saw that it was good. Here comes the good part. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the flying creatures of the sky, over the livestock, over the whole earth, and over every crawling creature that crawls on the land." God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the land and conquer it. Rule over the fish of the sea, the flying creatures of the sky, and over every animal that crawls on the land." Then God said, "I have just given you every green plant yielding seed that is on the surface of the whole land, and every tree which has the fruit of a tree yielding seed. They are to be food for you. Also for every wild animal, every flying creature of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the land which has life, every green plant is to be food." And it happened so. So God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. So there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. So the heavens and the earth were completed along with their entire array. God completed on the seventh day his work that he made, and he ceased on the seventh day from all his work that he had made. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, for on it he ceased from all his work that God created for the purpose of preparing. Now, what do we see in this poem? Because it is a poem. The Hebrew term that he's using after he made mankind was Tov Meod. Very good. Then we go into Genesis 2 for just a little bit. And God rests. Now, what do we see here? Take just a moment and think about what we're seeing. Because if we step back, we may not see that this poem is about the things that that we think it's about. Not saying that it's not about creation, because it is. But what are some of the problems here? Let's talk about how green plants show up on day 3, but there's no sun until day 4. Could God do it? 100%. Does it make a whole bunch of sense? Not really. Also, think about how, if the sun and moon weren't created until day 4, how do you even count a day? How is there evening and morning without the sun and the moon? It really becomes clear, if you start to look at this poem, that this is not a scientific retelling of creation. Now, could God in all of his infinite power, wisdom, and majesty do creation exactly the way this is in this poem? 100%. God can do whatever he wants. Now, we're going to talk about, I think I talked about this in the previous video, things that are written in blood, things that are written in pen, and things that are written in pencil. Things that are written in blood are things that are not up for debate. Jesus is Lord. He died on the cross. He rose from the dead. He was born of a virgin. He lived a sinless life. He's equal with God and the Holy Spirit. All that stuff, blood. Don't debate it, right? He's ruling, he's reigning. There's only one way to God, is through Jesus. Blood. I would say literal 7-day creation, all this other stuff, is either pencil or pen. My salvation, my theology, all the stuff, my belief in Jesus is no different whether I think this is a literal 7 days, whether I think this took a long time, doesn't matter to me. It might matter to you, and that's okay. You can think whatever you want to think about this, and we can still be friends and be in unity and be in communion as Christian brothers and sisters, because Jesus is bigger than these little things that we can quibble over, right? Great. Now, as we continue to look at this poem, we start to notice, if we look at day 5, that fish go in the water, birds go in the sky, which means that day 5 corresponds with day 2. And if we look at day 1, where we separate light from dark, we notice that things go in the sky. Now, we have to ask ourselves, as people who would be operating from an ancient Hebrew understanding of the stars and the moon and the sun, Are they thinking that these are big, gaseous balls of fire in the middle of the sky? Are they aware that the Earth is actually rotating around the sun? Do they know that the moon is rotating around the Earth? Do they know that there's planets up there because they move differently than the stars do? I would say if we're going to go with Moses is writing this during the wanderings in the desert, they don't. But they do know that the ancient cultures around them, Egypt, Samaria, all those people, worship these things in the sky. So, are we going to think that God created heavenly beings, what we would understand as angels, on day 4? Maybe. I think that makes sense. Once again, it's written in pencil. You can think, no, absolutely not. And we can still be in community with each other because we are Christian brothers and sisters, right? Okay. First 3 days, God separates light from darkness. God separates water from above from water from below. God separates water from land. In these first 3 days, he is separating stuff. And in the next 3 days, it seems like he's filling it. Stars in the sky, birds in the air, fish in the sea, mammals on the land. Well, mammals, reptiles, whatever you have. Creeping things on the land. And then the crowning achievement, it seems, the Tov Meod, the very good, is us. Humans. Made in the image of God. The triune image of God. Let us make mankind in our image. Right? So, he separates all this other stuff. Now, what we're starting to see here is a literary device that shows up a lot in your Bible called a chiasm. And a chiasm is all about finding treasure. So, let's break this down. So what a chiasm is it's kind of like bookends, right? Well, let's just get into it. So, as you can see, 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, and 6 very nicely correspond with each other, right? You can almost draw a line down the middle. If you fold it together like a book, then the middle would be somewhere in there. Anyway. Now, Westerners like to teach by making a point and then giving like supporting evidence or logic or reasoning, but Easterners have a fundamental belief that the best way to learn is not with a transfer of information. That true learning is all about discovering the truth for yourself. And the art of discovery is everything in this Eastern culture. Which means that they write their stories with little, the rabbis called it pearls, hidden pearls, okay? Now, it's not going to be in your face. You gotta kind of like hunt for it. And this isn't Bible code stuff. Like if you do even a little bit of research, you can find that this is like a thing. Okay? So, one of the tools for hiding treasure in these texts is a chiasm. Which means the first part of the story mirrors the last part of the story. And it can mirror in two different ways. It can either be ABCD, DCBA, meaning it actually mirrors each other, or it can be ABCD, DCBA, or it can be ABCD, ABCD, which is like a inverted parallelism. I don't even know if that's the right word for it. That's a word that I'm just using. But anyway, it can also be structured almost visually. So that same like ABC, CBA order, you can actually see a chiasm like shaped like an arrow. Okay? Either directly or inverted. It can be shaped like an hourglass. It can be shaped like an arrow, or with like an arrow pointing to the center, or it can be shaped like a diamond, where it gets larger and then it gets smaller again. But everything is driven towards the center. It mirrors. It's like a book folded up on itself. Now, what's interesting about Genesis 1 is it's not the easiest chiasm to start with because it's actually both of the chiasms we talked about at once, ABCCBA and ABCABC. Now, if you look at your NIV Bible, you might notice, if you look at Genesis 1, that the first day of creation is like a tiny paragraph. The second day of creation is a little bit bigger, and the third day of creation is big. Followed by another big paragraph, followed by another slightly smaller paragraph, followed by a tiny paragraph. That's what makes the Genesis chiasm a little confusing, but we'll come back to that later. And it's like the creation of man is purposely kind of sticking out in this story because the exception is that day 6 would be a baby paragraph if it wasn't for the creation of man. What I mean by Genesis 1 being the two types of chiasm is that we have the corresponding 1 to 4, 2 to 5, 3 to 6, but when we also have this kind of like inverted hourglass type thing, right? This is an incredibly, beautifully put together piece of literature. And that's why we can say that this is probably not a science lab report thing. It has nothing to do with monkeys or apes or seven literal days. It's actually trying to tell us something even deeper than what it just says on the surface level. Now, if you want to make sure I'm not just making this up, let's go back and make sure that what we're really dealing with is a poem. If you go back and look at it one more time, you should, if this is a poem, it should have a cadence. You should have a rhythm, and you should have numbers that jump out at you. We've already talked about the different refrains and how these work as a cadence or a rhythm. It was good, it was good, it was evening, it was morning. But then there's also patterns. We pointed out that there were 3 days over here and 3 days over here. So we would want to see a pattern of 3. Well, if you remember at the beginning of the poem, we had a 3-ness in the creator. The creator was a creator, he was a speaker, and he was a spirit hovering over the water. Trinity. There was a 3-ness speaking of the creation. He said the poem was about creating and restoring. That's that word bara, which is like the same word for creating that we'd use for a painter or a sculptor. Someone who's creating artistically. The word bara appears 3 different places in the poem. At the beginning, once in the middle, and then once at the end. And at the end, when the word bara appears, it appears 3 times over really quick in the last few verses. We have all kinds of patterns of 3. 3 days of separation, 3 days of filling, a 3-part nature to this spiritual being, and a 3 mention of bara at the closing of the poem. We would also look at 7 days, and we might expect there to be patterns of 7 in the poem. That would be expected. When we look at the poem, we realize that the first verse in the Hebrew has 7 words in it. So that's 7 one time. We have all kinds of patterns of 3. The second verse has 14 words in it. 7 a second time. Or 7 times 2. The word earth occurs 21 times in the poem. 21 is 7 times 3. There are 35 words in the 7th verse of the poem. 7 times 5. The word God is mentioned 35 times in the poem. 7 times 5. The phrase "it was so" appears 7 times in the poem, and the phrase "and God saw" appears 7 times in the poem. Now, as I have heard this taught, the statement was made that if I see patterns of 3 and if I see patterns of 7, the only logical question would be to ask whether or not there are any patterns of 10. Which we might kind of laugh at and think it's a funny question until we realize the phrase "to make" appears 10 times in this poem. The phrase "according to his kind" occurs 10 times in the poem. The phrase "and God said" occurs 10 times in this poem. 3 times in reference to people, 7 times in reference to creatures. The phrase "let there be" occurs 10 times in the poem. 3 times in reference to things in the heavens, 7 times in reference to things on the earth. This poem is full of patterns of 3s and 7s and 10s. It is a chiasm. Now, how does the chiasm work? How do we find this buried treasure? Well, like we said, chiasms point toward the center. If you look at what we just went through, the entire chiasm points towards the center. And what we have at the center is what? So let's think this through. What did creation start with? In the beginning, there's nothing. Tohu vavohu is the term. Wild and waste. Now, at the end, what does God do? He rests. Which means he does what? Nothing. This poem, at both ends, has God resting. He's doing nothing before he creates. He's doing nothing after he creates except enjoying. This starts with nothing and ends with nothing. If you take this creation poem and you actually physically count Hebrew word, there's a Hebrew word that lies dead in the center of this poem. And that word is moad. Now, in the old translations, we would translate this as seasons. It shows up right where you would want it to. If you consider that there are 7 creation days, you would expect the center of this poem to lie somewhere in day 4. Well, in fact, on day 4, God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars to mark the days, the years, the seasons, or the moad. I think the NIV, my NIV says sacred times. Now, moad ends up being one of the 4 words that we translate Sabbaths, or at least the idea of Sabbath. Like sacred times would be the Jewish festivals, and the Jewish festivals all have to do with Sabbath. This is one of our 4 words we use to talk about Sabbath, which is exactly what God does at the end of the poem. He establishes the Sabbath, the Shabbat. Now, if you've read the Gospels, you realize how big a deal Shabbat was, because Jesus just keeps getting in trouble for doing things that people think are breaking Shabbat. The first occurrence of someone breaking Shabbat in the Old Testament, in Exodus, I think it's Exodus, the dude gets stoned to death for breaking the Sabbath. It's a big deal. So why would Sabbath be the center point of a poem about creation? It's kind of anticlimactic, huh? All this build-up about chiasms, all the stuff about treasure and pearls, and the center of the chiasm is moad, Sabbath. Something that people argue today about even is a New Testament practice. Isn't Jesus our rest? Well, yes, he is. But you have to go back. Again, who did we talk about that tradition tells us is writing this story? Moses. Where is Moses writing this? Where does he receive this information? Sinai? The desert? We know he's meeting with God face to face. What's God telling him? Is he helping him reclaim the story of his people? You can assume so. He gives him Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Now, if they're at Sinai and they get this information, where are they coming from? Egypt. They're coming from Egypt. They've been in Egypt a long time, 430 years. What have they been doing? They've been making bricks. So, if you've been making bricks for 430 years, you are enslaved people who've just been liberated. But you were a slave, your dad was a slave, your granddad was a slave, his dad was a slave. What do you think your value is? Would you say that your only value is in what you produce? It's not like you have dreams and aspirations as a slave. You're just going to make bricks. And if you can't make bricks, how will you ever provide for your family? If you're no longer there, how are you going to protect your wife and your kids? I think we all know what Egypt is going to do to your wives and daughters if you're no longer there to provide for their family. Isn't it beautiful that the very first story that God gives us in the Bible gives his people in the desert the buried treasure in the center is you can rest. You can take a break. Because I created you and you are very good. You are the crowning creation. After God tells us after he made us, he just sat back and watched. It's almost as if God is telling this people who just came out of slavery that your worth is not based on what you can produce. It's based on the way that I created you. It's based on your position as my creation, not your performance on what you do. If you're a slave, how many days a week do you work? I'd assume 7. And how long do you work? All day. So God, in this beautiful first chapter, is saying, before we do anything, before we go out in this desert, y'all need to take a break. Because you need to be reminded that your value and your worth does not come from what you can produce. It comes from who you are. The reason that the creation of mankind sticks out in this story, almost as if it's not supposed to be there, is because we were the crowning moment of creation. Because why else does God rest at the end? He's not tired. He doesn't get tired. He doesn't need to take a break. Now, what would happen? Okay, well, let's ask the question before we go there. Why does God rest? Well, think about the statue of David. If the sculptor who sculpted David had just kept on chiseling and kept on chiseling and kept on chiseling and kept on chiseling, the statue would be about this big and we wouldn't be able to tell what it was. God's an artist, right? Bara means to create like an artist. If an artist just keeps adding to the art he's creating, eventually it's not art. He'll ruin it. If a painter keeps putting paint on a canvas, he'll ruin it. If a wood carver keeps carving the wood, it'll disappear. What's interesting is God creates us. He says, this is my image. I give it dominion. And then it's like he just sits back and looks at what he's made and is happy. Now, what's interesting is we talked about the refrains, There was evening and there was morning. Every day 1, evening and morning. Day 2, evening and morning. Day 3, evening and morning. Day 4, evening and morning. Day 5, evening and morning. Day 6, evening and morning. Day 7, there's no it was evening and morning. It's as if the author is putting the seventh day out there with no stopping point. The true story of Genesis 1 is that God knew when to say, this is good. This is enough. And the beautiful thing about that is he says this is enough after he creates the humans, before the humans have done anything. So, live your life knowing that you were good creation. You still are good creation. Sorry. We live in a fallen world. But don't start your story at Genesis 3. Start your story at Genesis 1. It's not about what you produce. It's about who you are and whose you are. And you are loved and created by the Father. And there is nothing, not a thing, you can do to earn that love. Just receive it and rest in it. We'll see you later for Genesis chapters 2 and 3.